Alright, this is going to be part 2 of the America series, explaining the nature of the United States government versus the corporate United States. So, in order to understand this, you have to start with the Constitution. You have to start with what the American government is actually authorized to do. So, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, they said something along the lines of, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and have certain unalienable rights, including the rights to life, liberty, and property." That's, I think they said pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence, but it's generally understood that the Founding Fathers valued the right to life, liberty, and property, because those things are necessary for a human's autonomy. Now, if you look at the Constitution, I urge you to go back and read the Constitution and just understand what it literally says. So a lot of it is talking about procedures for seating certain offices. It establishes the Senate and the Congress and the judicial branch and the executive branch with the president. So it talks about all those procedural things. And then it also talks about what the government is authorized to do and what it's not authorized to do. Now, the Constitution did not enumerate all of the rights that citizens retained. It was basically a document detailing what the purpose of our government was, which was to govern the government, to have administrative authority when one citizen violates another citizen's rights, and for that to set up the judicial branch. Now, when it got ratified, the stipulation was for the Bill of Rights to be added as amendments. And you have all of the amendments that people know, right to free speech. The Second Amendment, which is widely misunderstood, they say that it protects firearms rights, but it actually just protects the right for the country to have a militia and for people to have militia-style weapons. And there's a Supreme Court ruling about that. I think there's a guy who argued Second Amendment because he was deprived his right for a shotgun. Shotgun was ruled a non-militia style weapon, and therefore he lost the case. What actually is at issue with the Second Amendment is the 9th and 10th Amendments, which is rights enumerated in the Constitution are not to disparage other rights retained by the people, which means they've not said all of the rights, but there are assumed God-given inalienable rights that the people retain, and this has to be interpreted within the original context of the Constitution, and this is what holds up in court. For example, the Constitution says nothing about the right to travel. It says nothing about a citizen being able to use the roads, the public roads, unrestricted. However, that is how the Supreme Court has consistently ruled, because the ability for a citizen to travel using his own personal property as a means of transportation in the same way that they did when the Constitution was originally framed, that has been seen necessary for a person's life so that they can get resources and bring them back to their place, so that they can buy, sell, and trade the fruits of their or someone else's labor, which is a right recognized by the Constitution. And liberty. Liberty is, you can't have liberty if you can't go from place to place, and that's why the roads are owned by the public and not by the state. They may be state maintained, but they are public roads. Now, some roads are private access only. That's just how it just depends on how they're set up. But those private access ones are really the minority, and people don't use them for traveling. As far as state maintained goes, it's actually the corporate state who's maintaining them at this time. And that does not mean that they own them. It just means that they have taken over the duty of maintaining those roads and collecting funds somehow. However, a lot of people will argue if you say, blow through a toll booth or don't want to pay your taxes that go towards the road. Well, if you're doing that on principle, because it's going to the corporate state, which is funding foreign wars and such, I mean, that's your choice. And if someone says you just don't want to pay your fair share, I mean, all they have to do is come up with a legitimate way of raising funds, because the Constitution did allow for the government to collect taxes, but there were certain restrictions on how those taxes could be collected, and that is enumerated in the Constitution. And the fact is that the original jurisdiction government today is not collecting any taxes. There is no tax program. Every tax that you believe you're paying is actually going to the corporate state, and you are obligated to pay it only through your contractual obligations between the Social Security card holder and the IRS, or, yeah, I think it's pretty much the IRS, because even sales tax. So, the Constitution guarantees people's rights, individual rights, and that set up the idea that the United States of America is a nation of sovereigns, not a sovereign nation. This is also evidenced by the fact that the federal government is prohibited from owning land except in certain cases, like the capital city, and then land that is held by the federal government but for public use, which means the federal government doesn't own it, it just holds it on behalf of the public. So, the 10th Amendment is that rights not given, or authority not given to the federal government is reserved for the people and the states respectively. So, if you interpret that out of context, you can think, well, maybe the people don't actually have any rights, they were just giving those rights to the states. But you can't interpret it this way, because the precedents in the judicial system rules that those rights are reserved by the people and not by the states. The states just have the authority to do certain things which the federal government wasn't granted to. But you still can't take more authority from the people than the people have. So if I don't have the authority to compel you to do anything, that's a violation of your rights. If you don't have the authority to compel me to do anything, that's a violation of my rights. The government doesn't have that authority because it's not a sovereign nation, it's a nation of sovereigns. It's a really important thing to understand. So, when you understand the Constitution from this perspective, and you understand that the Constitution, the government cannot just add an amendment that says, now we have the authority to do this. They can't give themselves more authority than they were granted by the Constitution. So any amendment posing to do that is unconstitutional, and therefore has no authority. And if it has no authority, then it must be an arm of the corporate state and not of the original jurisdiction government. So, I will leave it at that. That's the basics of the Constitution that you need to understand in order to understand the difference between the corporate state and the original jurisdiction government. So, the next video will be about the corporate state, how it was formed, and how you can distinguish it from the original jurisdiction government.